So at the beginning of the course, I told you that version control systems fall into two groups, centralized and distributed. In centralized systems like Subversion, we have a single repository that is shared by all team members. The problem with these systems is that everyone is dependent on this central repository. If the server that is hosting this repository goes offline, no one can commit or view the project history. In distributed systems like Git, every developer has a repository on their machine. So they're not dependent on a central server. They can work offline with their local repository. But how can we collaborate with this model? Well, we can synchronize our work directly with each other, but this is often too complex and error-prone. Instead, we can use what we call the centralized workflow. So everyone has their local repository, but there's also a central repository they use to synchronize their work. This is the workflow used in most private teams and closed-source projects. But you might be asking, hey Mosh, what is the point of this workflow? How is it better than a centralized version control system like Subversion? Well, with this model, we don't have a single point of failure. We can work with our local repository, and if the central repository is unavailable for a period of time, we can synchronize our work directly. Now, where should we put this central repository so it's accessible to all team members? Well, some organizations put this repository on a server in their private network. Others prefer to use Git hosting services like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, and so on. With all these services, we can set up our repository as a private repository, so it's only accessible to our team and no one else. So let's walk through a real scenario. John and Amy want to collaborate on a project. They start off by cloning or taking a copy of this central repository. Now they both have a local repository on their machine. So John starts working and makes a few commits. Amy could be making other commits in the meantime, but let's not worry about that yet. Now, at some point, John needs to share his work with Amy. To do that, he uses the push command to send his commits to the central repository. The central repository is now in sync with John's work. Now, Amy can use the pull command to bring in John's work into her local repository. If John's work conflicts with Amy's work, she has to resolve the conflicts and then push her changes to the central repository. So this is the centralized workflow, which is used in most private teams. Everyone in the team has push access to write to the central repository. We have another workflow for open source projects called Integration Manager Workflow. In an open source project, we have one or more maintainers and many contributors. The problem is that we don't know these contributors, so we cannot trust them enough to give them push or write access to our repository. Only the maintainers of the project have push access to the project repository. So if you want to contribute, first we should fork the project repository to get a copy of this repository in the cloud. Next, we clone this repository to get a local copy on our machine. We make a few commits, and when we're ready to share our work, we do a push to send our commits to our forked repository. Next, we send a pull request to the maintainer of the project. This is a feature built into platforms like GitHub. I'll show you how to do that later in this section. So the maintainer of the project gets notified. Then they can pull in our changes, review them, and if they're happy, they can merge our work into their local repository and then push the merged changes to the official repository. This is called the Integration Manager Workflow because someone is in charge of integrating changes. We cannot push directly to this official repository. That's why we have to fork it to get a copy in the cloud. Because this repository is in the cloud, it's also visible to the maintainer of the project, and that's how they can pull in our changes. All right, that's it for workflows. Next, we're going to create a GitHub repository to see these workflows in action.